Today's daf, which is the last in Masechet Shekalim, is daf Chaf Beis, and we're going to start with the Mishnah on the bottom of Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. By way of introduction, we're talking about kodshim shenifsalu. Now, kodshim could become possible in many different ways, and our Mishnah is going to hone in on a case of kodshim shenitma'u, they became tamei. But as a general rule, kodshim shenifsalu are burnt in a place called the Beis Hadeshen, which is right to the east of the Mizbeach in the Azara. That's where they would burn kodshim shenifsalu. However, our Mishnah is focused on basar kodshim shenitma, that the psul was a psul tumah. And with regard to psul tumah, we may want to burn the kodshim outside of the Azara, and that's going to be the question here in our Mishnah. There are two variables that have to be considered here. One variable is what level of tumah the basar of kodshim was contaminated, and the other issue is going to be, the other variable is where it became tamei. Because if it became tamei outside of the Azara, then to bring the tumah into the Azara and burn it there is, so to speak, an insult to the Azara. So that we may want to be more lenient about burning these kodshim shenitmu inside the Azara, and in case where it became tamei inside the Azara, we don't have to take it into the Azara, it's already in the Azara. Now, first, the Mishnah addresses the question of the level of tumah that it contracted. Bein bi'ava tumah, bein b'vlada tumah. We're going to have machlokas in the Gemara what vlada tumah means over here, but whether it's an original tumah, which means that the basar came in contact with an ava tumah, or it's a vlada tumah, in which case the basar came in contact with a liquid that was in contact with the ava tumah. Bein bifnim, bein bachutz, whether the tumah took place in or outside of the Azara. Beit Shammai omrim, Beit Shammai, you're going to say that the only time that we will burn it outside the Azara is if you have two strikes against you. Meaning, if it's both a tumah on the highest level, which is called ava tumah, and number two, it was nitma outside the Azara. If you have both A and B, then we're going to burn it outside the Azara. But as a general rule, barring that exceptional case, hakol yisarif bifnim, we will always burn the kodshim shenitma'u according to Beit Shammai inside the Azara, chutz, unless you have both negatives. Shenitma bi'ava tumah, it was contaminated on the highest level of tumah directly from an ava tumah, and bachutz as well. The tumah took place outside of the Azara. We don't want to take tumah, especially tumah of an ava tumah nature, into the Azara. Beis Hill says no. Akol yisarif bachutz. In all cases, we will burn kodshim shenitmu outside the Azara unless we have two reasons lekula, to be lenient. Chutz mishenitma bevlada tum bifnim. In a case where A, the tumah that it contracted was only that of a vlada tumah, and B, it was already nitma. The tumah took place, occurred inside the Azara. In those cases, and only in that case, I should say, and only in that case where you have an overlap of A plus B. Again, it was a low level tumah of a vlada tumah. Number two, it was nitma bifnim. Then and only then, according to Beis Hill, will we burn it inside the Azara. And now we turn to Daf Chaf Beis Amud Aleph. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Shenitma bi'ava tumah. Everything depends upon one single factor, and that is what level of tumah we're dealing with. That's the crucial factor that will determine where you burn the kodshim shenitma. If it was nitma bi'ava tumah, I don't care where it was nitma. It's a very severe and profound tumah. Is he sarif bachutz? If it's nitma with an avatuma, then avatuma came in contact, sheretz or nevela came in contact with the basar, that basar has to be burnt outside the azor, according to Rabbi Eliezer. However, nitma bevlada tuma, if it was a lower level tuma, that means a liquid that came in contact with an avatuma, now came in contact with the basar, in such a case, we will burn it inside, and even if it was nitma bachutz. Shenitma bevlada tuma bein bachutz bein b'fnim, meaning even if it was nitma bachutz, which means we're taking something that's tamei inside the azar to burn it, we will do so. Yisarif b'fnim. Now we have a third opinion, actually a fourth opinion, I should say, and that's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva omer makom tumasol sham seifas. Forget about whether it's nitma bi'ava tuma, whether it's nitma bevlada tuma. The level of tuma is irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is where it became tame. If it became tame inside, we'll burn it inside. If it became tame outside the azar, we'll burn it outside the azar. Now we have a machlokes in the Gemara about how to interpret the words vlada tuma. Bar kapara amar ava tuma dvar Torah vlada tuma midivreihem. A vlada tuma means, and this is really the way we were describing it when we interpreted the Mishnah, is a derabanan. What's a derabanan? Let's say the avatuma was mitame a mashke, which is doraisa, because an avatuma is mitame adam, kalim, and mashkim and ochlim. Now the mashke is tame doraisa, but it is a vlada tuma, and that vlada tuma does not have the power to be mitame kalim, and therefore it is a tuma d'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan made a gzeira in which they established and recognized that a vlada tuma in the case of mashkin could be mitame kalim, and the reason for that is because we were afraid you mix it up with other mashkin which are avatuma, like for example something that comes out of the body of a zav or a zava. Rabbi Yochanan Amar bein zeh ubein zeh dvar Torah. Rabbi Yochanan says that even a vlada tuma is doraisa. What does that mean? So whereas Bar Kapara was dealing with a case of basar that became tamei from a keli, the keli in turn became tamei from a mashke. So you have a mashke that came in contact with an avatuma. The mashke now is mitami kelim dirabbanan, tuma dirabbanan, according to Bar Kapara, and the basar went into that keli. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, he interprets that vlada tuma is doraisa. What does that mean? Let's say the kli was mitami the basar, and the kli itself came in contact with an avatuma. That makes the kli into a rishon l'tuma, because an avatuma is mitami keli, and the basar going into the keli is now a sheni l'tuma, and that's a tuma doraisa. So that the phrase vlada tuma is interpreted in two different ways, according to Bar Kapara and Rabbi Yochanan respectively. According to Bar Kapara, vlada tuma is a tuma d'Rabbanan, meaning that the mashke came in contact with the avatuma. Then the mashke went into a keli, and then the basar of kachim went into the keli. That's a tuma d'Rabbanan. The keli itself is only tuma d'Rabbanan, because a mashke cannot be mitami keli b'daraisa. The whole institution of a mashke being mitami keli is only d'Rabbanan. Rabbi Yochanan learns that we're talking about a case where the basar came in contact with a kli, but the kli itself was not nitma through a mashke, but rather was nitma through an avatum. So you had a sheretz that fell into a kli, and later on, the basar of kodesh of kachim was placed into that kli. That's a vlada tuma doraisa, and the Gemara is going to reject Rabbi Yochanan for two reasons. The kasha the Rabbi Yochanan al beis Shammai. According to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of our Mishnah, we have no way of justifying Beit Shammai. Why? To Beit Shammai, Omrim Akol Yisarif Bifnim, Chutz mishenitma b'av hatum b'chutz. The only time that we will burn the kodshim shenitmu outside the azor is when you have two strikes against you. It was a vlada tuma and it was nitma b'chutz. We don't want to take it inside. I'm sorry. If it was nitma b'av hatuma and it was nitma b'chutz, we don't want to take something that was nitma b'av hatuma b'chutz and take it into the mikdash in order to burn it on the Beis Hadeshin in the azor. So the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yochanan, I don't get it. Ma bein avatuma b'chutz, ma bein vladatuma b'chutz. Why should there be any difference between a case of avatuma shenit b'chutz or a vladatuma shenit b'chutz? In both cases, it's doraisa. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, the only logic that could be acceptable would be if you differentiate between whether it was nitma b'chutz or nitma b'fnim, and you have to take it if it's b'chutz inside. That we can understand, but to make a distinction between avatuma and vladatuma, according to Rabbi Yochanan, makes no sense because it's all doraisa. The meat went into the kli, and the kli had direct contact with an avatuma. Zevezel lo dvar torahi. And you have to ask it with an inflection of a question. Furthermore, the Gemara rejects Rabbi Yochanan even according to Beis Hillel. Why? I feel al Beis Hillel lo makasha. Is it not difficult? Certainly, it's difficult. The Beis Hillel Amri Amar Akol Yisar b'chutz. In all cases, we will burn kodshim shenitmu b'chutz, chutz, unless we have two pluses, right? Two leniencies. Mashenitma bivlada tuma bifnim. The tumah took place inside the azara, and it was nitma bevlada tumah. According to you, Rabbi Yochanan, ma bein vlada tumah bifnim, ma bein ava tumah bifnim. You're telling me that if it was an ava tumah bifnim, then what would be the din according to Beis Hillel? We'd have to take it out of the azara in order to burn it. But if it's a vlada tuma that nitma b'fnim, we burn it inside. What difference it makes? But zevezel lo dvar toru, both a vlada tuma according to Rabbi Yochanan, as well as, of course, an ava tuma doraisa. So Beis Hillel makes no sense. So at this point, the Gemara just simply ignores Rabbi Yochanan. In our Gemara, we don't have any defense of Rabbi Yochanan. Again, the Achronim here will try to come up with some answer. So therefore, lo havi be'rabbanan ella al divar kapar. From now on, we're not going to pay any attention to Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to assume, like bar kapar, we have to interpret this Mishnah that vlada tuma means a tuma dirabbanan, like bar kapar. The kasha, but we still have a difficulty. The bar kapar al beis Shammai. Why? The Beit Shammai omrim akol yisarif mibifnim chutz mishenitma v'yav hatuma b'chutz. The only time that we will force you to take this kodshim shenitmu outside the azara for purposes of sreifa is only if it's nitma b'av hatuma b'chutz. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, ma ben av hatuma ben b'chutz u'ben b'fnim ze v'zer lo dvar torahu. Why should there be any difference between b'chutz u'b'fnim in the case of an avatuma? According to you, Bar Kapara, the distinction, the contrast here, is between Tumah D'Oraisa and Tumah D'Rabbanan. But once you get to Tumah D'Oraisa, that's reason to take the kodshim and burn it outside the Azara. So what difference to make it was nitma b'fnim nifna b'chutz? So obviously we have another variable here, which Gemara, we assumed that variable from the very get-go of the sugi, but the Gemara now wants to clarify what is that variable. Why is it important to know where the nitma was? And the answer is, begin to Rabbi Akiva the Omer. Rabbi Akiva formulated a principle. Makom tumaso sham tehes reifos. There's a procedural requirement, a technical legal regulation that wherever it became tameh, that's where you should burn it. And therefore, Beit Shammai ruled that if you have basar that was nitma by an avatuma, and it's tuma doraisa, if it was nitma outside of the azor, we burn it outside the azor. Why? Because makom tumaso sham tehei sreifas. You'll ask me, what about the case of nitma bivlada tuma bichutz? And yet, Beit Shammai says in that case, there's only one factor that's stringent, therefore we will burn it inside. The answer is because it's a vlada tum, which is only d'Rabbanan, and that's relatively not really a tum. Now we're going to analyze Bar Kappar's understanding of the Mishnah within the framework of Beis Hillel. Afilu al Beis Hillel lo makasha. Again, is there no question to be raised as far as Beis Hillel? Even in Beis Hillel, we're missing an element in the equation. The Beis Hillel Omar hakol yisar pachutz chutz mishen nitma bevlada tum bifnim. We need two factors lekula in order to allow us to burn it inside. It's got to be number one, vlada tuma, number two, it contracted tuma inside the azor. We don't have to bring it into the azor for streifa purposes. So the Gemara asks, ma bein vlada tuma, bein bifnim, u bein bachutz. If you're telling me, according to Bar Kappar, that since it's a vlada tuma, it's an insignificant tuma, and therefore we could burn it inside, then why does Beis Hillel insist that we will only burn a vlada tum inside if it contracted tumah inside the azara? Zeh lo midivreyamu. In both cases, whether it contracted tumah inside or outside the azara, is it not essentially a tumah d'Rabbanan? And the answer is you're missing another element in the equation. Begin to Rabbi Shimon. What was Rabbi Shimon's formulated principle? Omar. Machalo umashko shel mitzora mishtalchin chutz l'shalosh machnos. That if a mitzora takes part in drinking or in eating the food or the drink, has to be sent out of 3 machnos, which means not only the machna shechina, which includes the azara, not only the machna levia, which includes the areas of the harabayis outside the azara, but even from the 3rd machna, which is Yerushalayim, the city of Yerushalayim, that's called chutz l'shalosh machnos. And therefore, when we have this halacha that an object that became tameh should be under certain circumstances, in the case of ochlin umashkin of a mitzvah has to be sent 3 chutz l'3 machnos, and now we're talking about basar kodshim, which is also in the gather of machol of ochel, and it has to be sent out of 3 machnos, then therefore, even if the tumah was only a tumah d'Rabbanan, we're not going to take it into the azara. So if you have basar that was nitma outside of the azara, we have to burn it outside the azara, even though it's a tumah d'Rabbanan. So let's just summarize now the 4 shitos of the Tanoi. Rabbi Akiva holds that when you have basar kodshim shenitmu, it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a tumah d'oraisa, tumah d'Rabbanan, everything depends upon where it contracted tumah. If it contracted tumah in the azor, we burn it in the azor. If it contracted tumah outside the azor, we burn it outside the azor. Beit Shammai basically accepted the theory and the formulation of Rabbi Akiva, but they disagree with Rabbi Akiva in one factor. They hold that if the tumah was only a vlada tumah d'Rabbanan, according to Bar Kappar's interpretation, then it's burnt inside the azara, like all kodshim shenitmu are burnt into the azara, even though it was nitma outside the azara. Why? Because a tumah d'Rabbanan relative to a tumah d'oraisa is considered like it's not tummy at all, and we can take it into the azara and we can burn it in the azara. Rabbi Eliezer, on the other hand, says we don't care where it became tameh. Rabbi Eliezer is completely oblivious to Rabbi Akiva's distinction between where it became tameh. Everything depends upon the level of tumah. If it was contaminated by an avatuma, we burn it outside the azara. If it was contaminated by a vlada tuma d'Rabbanan, we will burn it inside the azara. Beis Hillel hold, like Rabbi Eliezer, the main critical element is the severity of the tumah. What level of tumah we're dealing with? But in addition to Rabbi Eliezer, Beis Hillel say that if this davar nitma, even if it's Rabbanon, is outside the Azara, that's where the tumah took place. We don't bring it into the Azara. And now we're up to the Mishnah here in the middle of Daf Chaf Beis Amud Aleph. And this is the last Mishnah in Masechet Shekalim. Evrei Atamid, the Tanim Michatzi Kevesh Ulamata B'Mayrov. Again, there are Girsah issues here, but we're going to go to Girsah B'Mayrov. But Shel Musafim, the Tanim Michatzi Kevesh Ulamata B'Mizrach. And what was happening here is that with regard to the burning of the Avarim, we have to make a clear-cut distinction between the Tamid and the Musafim. Even though these are all Karbanos Olah, but it's very possible if you don't put them in two separate places, you might mix them up together. And that we can't do. Now, again, we would need here a little bit of a picture of the Beis HaMikdash, but basically we could say that on the Daram, which is on the left side of the Mizbeach HaChitzoni, there was a Kevesh, and this was a ramp that was 32 amos long, 16 amos wide. Now, after the Shechita of the Tamid, and they were Makabel the Dam, they were Zorik the Dam on Karnos HaMizbeach. However, the Avarim were not yet ready to be burnt on the Mizbeach. In the middle, wedged in between the Zrikas Adam and the Aktaras Haivarim, there was a whole long avoda, a whole long procedure. The Kohen would recite Kriyat Shema, and then they would begin the Ktores and go on to the menorah. And finally, after this whole process, the Avarim of the Tamid would be put on the Maracha to be burnt on the Mizbeach. Where were the Avarim placed in the interim period? If we're talking about the Tamid, then it was placed on the Ma'irav, on the lower part of the Kevesh, on the Ma'irav side, on the western side. Now, the western side, because when you enter into the Mikdash, you enter through the east, and as you go up until you reach the Kodesh Kodashim, you're always moving to the west. So we wanted to give a covet to the carbon Tamid, which is so important. Therefore, we put the Avarim on the western side, closer to the Kodesh Kodashim. Now, when we get to Musaf, we have the same situation in regard to Musaf, that after the Shechita, Kabbalah, and Zrikas Adam, we weren't ready to burn the Emurim on the Maracha yet. We needed to do a whole bunch of different things in between. And the question is, where can we place the Avarim during this interim period, this interval period, to make sure that there's no mixture between those Avarim of the Musaf and the Avarim of the carbon Tamid? Because if they would get mixed up, then what would happen is, it could be, since they don't know the difference between these Avarim and those, they can't identify them, they might come to burn the Avarim of the Musaf before they burn the Avarim of the Tamid. And that you're not allowed to do. That's an Issa Torah to be makdim the Haktoras Haivarim of the Musaf before the Avarim of the Tamid. The Tamid Shel Shachar has to be first. So where would they place the Avarim of the Musaf to be separated? That's on the eastern side of the Kevesh. Now we get to the Avarim of another Karbonola, Shel Rosh Chodeshim. Right? There's a Musaf on Rosh Chodesh. We read about it today in our Tfilos. Nitanim al Karkov HaMizbeach Milamala. They had a different location, all the way on the top of the Mizbeach on the Karkov. We'll see in the Gemara what the Karkov is. Hashkolim v'abikurim einam noagim ela b'fnei habayis. The mitzvah of shkolim is dependent on the bias because the shkolim were earmarked for karbanos, carbon sibur. And as long as the mikdash stood, it was meaningful. Bikurim requires hanoch al gabi mizbeach, so you need a functioning base on mikdash. Avol ma'aser dagan, and now we have a hekesh between ma'aser behema and ma'aser dagan. Ubechoros, and the firstborn to a kosher animal. Nogim bein b'fnei habayis, bein shelo b'fnei habayis. Again, in the case of meiser, we'll give meiser to the Levi. In the case of bechar, we'll give the bechar to the Kohen. But the only problem is that what are you going to do with the animal? I mean, if the animal is a bechar, then it has to be brought on the mizbeach. So that's what we're going to see as we go along. Hamagdish shkolim ubikurim. What happens if during this period of time, after the Churban Habayis, a person went ahead, he was magdish shkolim, he says, Harei zeh shekel. Or he was magdish bikurim, he says, these are my first fruits. I wanted to be bikurim, but there's no migdash. It's Harei zeh kodesh. According to the Tanakama of our Mishnah, in both cases in Shkolim and Bikurim, he gave the status of Kodesh. It's Hegdesh. Even Bisman Hazeh, there's no Migdash, you were Magdash. But Rabbi Shimon disagrees. And Rabbi Shimon says, oh, Bikurim Kodesh. I agree with you that in the case of Bikurim, if he declares them as Kodesh and he's Mafresh Bikurim, even Bisman Hazeh, they are Bikurim. But in the case of, just the opposite of it. In the case of Shkolim, if he's Magdish Shkolim, it is Shkolim. But over Bikurim Kodesh, Eino Kodesh, that cannot be meaningful because what do you mean it's Kodesh? What do you do with Bikurim? Bikurim have to be brought on the Mizbeach. There is no Mizbeach. So it's a meaningless statement when he's Magdish Bikurim. And that's where Rabbi Shimon disagrees with the Chacham. The implication is that Rabbi Shimon would agree with Chacham that if he said a Rezu Shekel, then it would be valid. Ezu Karkov, the Gemara asks on Mizbeach, where is the Karkov? Amma ben Keren lekeren. On the top of the Mizbeach, there were 4 kronos. There was an Amma between each Keren, and it was the Mokum Hiluch Raglei HaKonim, when the Kohen had to go from one Keren to the other. They walked on this Karkov. Musafei Shabbos u'Musafei Rosh Chodesh mikodem. What comes first? On an overlap situation where Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbos, do we bring the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh first or the Musaf of Shabbos first? Rabbi Yirmiyah Sover L'Meimah, Rabbi Yirmiyah was of the opinion, initially at least, that Musafei Shabbos and Musafei Rosh Chodesh, Musafei Rosh Chodesh Kodem, which is very strange because we have a principle called Tadir V'Shein Tadir Tadir Kodem. So therefore, it should be crystal clear, L'chora, that Shabbos, which is more Tadir, should be first. So the Gemara says, Chayla de Rabbi Yirmiyah, what was the underlying logic of Rabbi Yirmiyah? It was based on a Mishnah in Sukkah. The Mishnah Masechet Sukkah says, Shiro shel Shabbos v'shiro shel Rosh Chodesh, Shiro shel Rosh Chodesh Kodem. When it's a question for the Levium to sing the songs during the Akrava, and they have 2 songs to sing. One is the song of Shabbos, the other is Rosh Chodesh. They should sing first the Shir of Rosh Chodesh. And Rabbi Yirmiyah took one step beyond and made the equation that if the Shir of Rosh Chodesh comes before the Shir of Shabbos, then likewise the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh should come before the Musaf of Shabbos. Amar Rabbi Yasa, Shanya hu Taman. There's a fundamental difference between Shir and Akrov. The Omer Rab Chia b'Shem Rab Yochanan. Kedei lefars melodia Rosh Chodesh. The reason is a separate halacha in Shir, and the reason why we are makdim the Shir of Rosh Chodesh to Shir of Shabbos is Kedei lefars, which means that when Bezdin had to be Makadish the Chodesh and decide which day is Rosh Chodesh, there were always 2 options depending on whether the previous month was a chasr or mole, there was a necessity to notify the people that Beis Din had clearly made an absolute certain decision that this day is Rosh Chodesh. And what method did they use? They didn't raise flags. They didn't have foghorns. They didn't have social media. What they had was the Shir of the Levium. So they wanted to make sure the Shir of Levium got a certain prominence because that was part of the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodoshim to be Makadish the Chodesh and notify the people. But when we talk about Akrava, Musafi Shabbos Sofi Rosh Chodesh, Musafi Shabbos Kodmin, Al Shem, because Kol HaTodir Mechavero Kodem Es Chavero. In other words, once we have the method of Shir to accomplish our goal of Lefarsim Moshe Rosh Chodesh, we don't need another double up to be Mefarsim Rosh Chodesh. We go back to the normal dinim and rules and regulations that govern Kedima, and in Hilchis Kedima Rosh Chodesh second to Shabbos, because Shabbos is Todi. Well, the Gemara asks, Keitzaru Osa. But wait a minute, you're involved in a contradiction because you're going to say the first Shir is going to be the Shir of what? Of Rosh Chodesh, but Akrava is Akrava of Shabbos. So Gemara says, Shokei Musafei Shabbos, V'homer Alem, Shiro Shel Rosh Chodesh. No problem. You are involved in the Hakrava of the Musaf of Shabbos, and you're singing the song of Rosh Chodesh. So in other words, we don't have to synchronize the song with the korban.